In early 1939, the UK's Neville Chamberlain government was laying the groundwork for a white paper that would slash Jewish immigration to British Mandate Palestine in a bid to quell a 3-year Arab revolt that had left hundreds of Jews and British servicemen dead. Britain's colonial secretary, 36-year-old Malcolm MacDonald, hoped to soften the blow by offering the Jews a patch of land elsewhere in the empire. The question was where. A year earlier, U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had convened a 31-nation conference in the French resort of Evian to discuss the plight of persecuted minorities in Hitler's Reich. The summit came to naught. Of all the participating countries, only the Dominican Republic, run by a military regime keen to whiten its island, was ready to admit Jews as farm workers. Other solutions would need to be found. Admitting Jews to Britain was scarcely considered. As revealed in cabinet transcripts at the National Archives in London, Home Secretary Samuel Hoare warned that, quote, "While he was anxious to do his best, there was a good deal of feeling growing up in this country, a feeling which was reflected in Parliament, against the admission of Jews." Chamberlain's ministers initially considered Kenya, then Northern Rhodesia, Zambia of today, but white settlers in both colonies adamantly objected. A few months after Evian, the state-sponsored riots known as Kristallnacht brought the full predicament of Germany's Jews, and more broadly Europe's, into stark relief. 5 days after the pogrom, Chamberlain received a Jewish delegation, including Lord Herbert Samuel, Palestine's first High Commissioner, and the Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann, who eventually served as the first president of Israel. By this point, the archives reveal his government had settled on a crown colony even further afield from Zion than the savannas of Africa. Chamberlain told them, quote, "As regards the question of mass settlement in some part of the empire, the Prime Minister thought that the only possible territory might be British Guiana." The 20th century had already seen several creative ideas for a new Zion. In 1903, an earlier Chamberlain, Neville's father Joseph, then colonial secretary, proposed to Theodore Herzl that the Jews make their national home in British East Africa, known as the Uganda Scheme. The land was actually in Kenya. Herzl had just traveled to Kishinev, the scene of a gruesome pogrom months earlier, and ultimately came around to the Uganda idea as a night asylum until conditions were ripe for a Jewish exodus to the land of Israel. A raucous debate ensued. The Zionist Congress that year approved exploring the Uganda scheme, only to reverse the decision 2 years later. Resistance to the plan was led by a young Weizmann. Just a few years before the Guiana proposal, authorities in Moscow turned the village of Birobidzhan, in Russia's Far East, bordering China, into the capital of the Jewish Autonomous Oblast. Birobidzhan was intended to help solve the so-called Jewish question through the cultivation of a Soviet-approved secular, socialist Jewish culture. Its language was to be not Hebrew, but Yiddish. Religion was strictly verboten. At its peak, perhaps 46,000 Jews lived in Birobidzhan, about a quarter of the population. Today, fewer than 1,000 remain, but the Jewish Autonomous Oblast survives. It is one of only 2 officially Jewish jurisdictions in the world. The other is Israel, and the only one where Yiddish is a recognized language. A large menorah dominates the entry to Birobidzhan Station on the Trans-Siberian Railway. At the same time that the British contemplated settling Jews in South America, Roosevelt's private secretary drafted a plan to send them to Alaska. FDR, for his part, favored Angola. The so-called Jewish desk of Nazi Germany's Foreign Office schemed to dispatch tens of thousands to Madagascar. The Dutch were the first Europeans to settle the stretch of South America's northern coast that they called the Guianas. The British seized the area's western portion, today's independent Republic of Guyana, in the early 19th century. A tiny white minority ruled from the capital Georgetown. Then as now, 90% of the populace was clustered along the coast. over a majority descended from indentured servants from India and African slaves. The interior presented inhospitable stretches of forests, savannas, and mountains, which, then as now, were either unpopulated or sparsely inhabited by indigenous tribes. And it is there, amid the Kanuku Mountains and Rupununi River in the country's southwest, that a newly formed commission explored the possibility of sending thousands of European Jews. The British Guiana Commission was a mixed British-American delegation tasked with reporting to the President's Advisory Committee on Political Refugees that Roosevelt had formed after Evian. Chaired by Edward Ernst, an American public health specialist, it included experts in agriculture and colonial administration, and one member, the agronomist Joseph Rosen, representing the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. The commissioners disembarked at Georgetown in mid-February 1939, and over the next 2 months, surveyed some 103,600 square kilometers, 40,000 square miles, by land and air. They evaluated soil quality, drainage, water availability, and vulnerability to malaria and yellow fever. They met with British officials and planters, some profoundly skeptical, others cautiously optimistic. A spirited debate played out in the local press. One Guyanese wrote anonymously to the Georgetown Daily Chronicle, quote, "The affairs of British Guiana must indeed be in desperate straits when the immigration of Jews is not only tolerated, but in some cases actually desired. While their plight is both pitiable and desperate, I do not see the necessity for making British Guiana the dumping ground for them." While there is no gainsaying the fact that Jews are gifted in economics and commerce, it is usually to the detriment of the country they reside in, as they have an unusual facility in amassing wealth. Would they become keen agriculturists? Can they be kept in the hinterland away from the city? We are expected to be burdened with the Jews, of whom other countries are today either expelling or refusing admission. He hoped the local authorities would, quote, "keep the Jews out of British Guiana," or, if this is impossible, to reduce their number to an inconsiderable minimum. A more sympathetic view came from Mortimer Bailey, president of the British Guiana and Trinidad Papaw Products Company, who wrote, quote, 500,000 Israelites given a home in British Guiana will adorn history as the most outstanding humane contribution Great Britain has ever made to civilization. Perhaps it is the Almighty's will that British Guiana should have remained all these years without population to become a promised land. To ameliorate the sufferings of these docile but highly industrious people is a thing that every inhabitant of British Guiana should be proud of doing. My close association for upwards of 30 years with Jews has been a period of satisfaction. They have shown me every kindness and rendered me a great assistance in business, both financially and morally. Yet even the magnanimous fruit magnate was not above a backhanded compliment toward his longtime partners in the papaya trade. He added, quote, "I do not hesitate to state that some of my aggressiveness is due to the business acumen I found among them during that association." In late April and early May 1939, the British cabinet agreed upon the final terms of what history would remember as the MacDonald White Paper, whereas just 4 years earlier in 1935, some 60,000 Jews had emigrated legally to British Mandate Palestine. The new policy would cap that number at 75,000, and not over 1 year, but spread over 5. Any further Jewish immigration would hinge on Arab consent, and it was clear to all that that consent would not be forthcoming. With war clouds gathering over Europe, Chamberlain told cabinet members, quote, "It was of immense importance to have the Moslem world with us. If we must offend one side, let us offend the Jews." Home Secretary Samuel Hoare, one of the keenest backers of Chamberlain's appeasement policies, agreed but added that, alongside the White Paper, quote, "we should hand over a whole colony to the Jews for settlement purposes." The most obvious, he said, was British Guiana. The cabinet transcript said in the passive voice, quote, The view was expressed that we might even be prepared to contemplate allowing an existing British colony to become a Jewish sovereign state. MacDonald strongly advised that the cabinet release the Guiana report ahead of the white paper to help cushion its impact. Settlement in South America could start as early as October of that year, and if it proved a success, he said, London should, quote, be prepared to make available practically the whole colony except the coastal belt. Chamberlain concurred. Ministers decided to publish the Guiana report on May 11th, along with a statement, quote, emphasizing its large possibilities. The white paper would follow exactly a week later. Few copies of the report survived. The National Library of Israel has one. A rare books dealer in New York is selling another for $680. Over 76 pages and 100 more of appendices, the commissioners acknowledged the obvious. The land was swampy, malaria was endemic, and large-scale development would require massive infrastructure investment. Still, they tried to strike a hopeful note and insisted with noticeable defensiveness, quote, the often repeated statement that Guyana is a pest hole with a tropical climate unfit for human habitation is definitely based on a misapprehension or deliberate misrepresentation. The climate is by no means unbearable, they added encouragingly. On relations with the indigenous population, they were persuaded there was little to worry about, writing, quote, as to the Indians themselves, there is good reason to believe they will welcome the coming of white settlers. They are an intelligent and well-disposed people, susceptible of a high degree of civilization they see in the project, 3 features highly desirable in their eyes: education, medical attention, and a market for their labor. The report concluded that the land had potential for agricultural and even some industrial development, and that significant Jewish settlement might ultimately be feasible. They recommended an initial 2-year trial of a population of 3,000 to 5,000 carefully selected young men and women to test whether Europeans could adjust to the harsh conditions of the Guyanese interior. The cost of launching such an experiment was estimated at $3 million, $150 million today. At no point were Jewish leaders asked how they viewed the prospect of moving to this remote corner of the British Empire. Once the report was released, they mostly ignored it. Meeting Colonial Secretary Malcolm MacDonald 2 days after, Chaim Weizmann refused to even utter the word Guyana. I just brushed it aside with a sweeping gesture, he recalled. The white paper, however, sparked massive protests, both in the Holy Land and the Jewish diaspora. Even the New York Times editorialized against it. At Jerusalem's Zion Square, British cables erroneously called it Zionist Square. A Jew with a Mauser shot dead a constable named Lawrence. David Ben-Gurion, then head of the Jewish Agency for Palestine, told British officials they were witnessing the beginning of Jewish resistance. 4 months later, the Second World War began. The Guiana Plan was binned, and throughout the war years, only a few dozen Jews were allowed to settle there. Very few would stay permanently. The Guiana affair is long forgotten. At the time it was said, the Jews referred to the place as British Gehenna, a biblical Hebrew word roughly analogous to hell. The allusion to the inferno was apt. Exactly 4 decades earlier, in 1899, the archetypal figure of the spurned Jew of Europe was finally released after 4 years' banishment and confinement, alone, on a rock off of the French-ruled eastern portion of Guyana. His place of exile was called Devil's Island. His name was Alfred Dreyfus, a French Jewish army captain falsely accused of treason and condemned in a wave of anti-Semitic hysteria that gripped France. After a sham trial, Dreyfus was stripped of his rank in a humiliating public ceremony and sent into solitary confinement on Devil's Island, a remote, disease-ridden rock off the coast of French Guiana. For nearly 5 years, he endured isolation, illness, and injustice, all while his case inflamed a bitter national debate over the soul of France, anti-Semitism, and the rights of Jews in modern Europe. The Dreyfus Affair, as it came to be known, divided the French public and galvanized a new generation of Jewish thinkers. Among them was a young Viennese journalist named Theodor Herzl, who witnessed the venom of the mob and concluded that Jews would never be safe without a state of their own. It was Dreyfus's ordeal that helped cement modern political Zionism, culminating in the State of Israel's founding in 1948.